Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee at 2 a.m. Elena Martinez pushes through the staff entrance with her badge clipped to dark scrubs, shoulders back, eyes forward. 6 years of night shifts have made her invisible here, a passing shadow between the fluorescent lights and the hum of machines that never stop. The hallway stretches ahead, linoleum tile reflecting the overhead panels in a rhythm that matches her breathing. She moves with economy of motion, no wasted steps, no acknowledgement of the residents who pass without seeing her. Just another nurse. Just someone's background. Her locker is in the far corner of the break room, tucked behind the door where it gets overlooked. Inside, she keeps 2 spare uniforms, a pair of compression socks, and one item she never looks at, a photograph turned face down. The edges are worn soft from handling. She hasn't opened it in 3 years. Some things are safer left in darkness. The night shift starts at 2,300 hours, old habits die hard, and Elena still thinks in military time even though those days are supposed to be buried. She clocks in at 22:47. 30 nights a month for 72 months. She has the numbers memorized. 720,000 minutes of being nobody, which is exactly the point. The Pentagon's order was specific: disappear into civilian life and never surface regardless of circumstance. She took it seriously. She took everything seriously. That was the problem. Walking toward the ICU, she passes the nurse's station where Dr. Caldwell stands reviewing charts. His new, 3 months in as chief of medicine, and his voice carries the particular arrogance of someone who has never learned that authority isn't the same as respect. His suit costs more than Elena's car payment. His watch is the kind that needs a waiting list. He glances up as she passes and his eyes move through her like she's a piece of furniture that doesn't match the decor but isn't worth replacing yet. She's already planning to request a floor reassignment. The calculation in his gaze makes her neck tighten. Martinez. His voice stops her before she reaches the ICU door. Not a request. Not a question. She turns, jaw steady, eyes level. You're on the trauma bay rotation tonight. Try not to break protocol. The way he says it suggests she makes a habit of it. She doesn't. She follows every rule written and most of the unwritten ones. She nods once and continues. She has learned that silence is armor. The trauma bay is quiet at 23:30. She stocks supplies, checks the crash cart, verifies that the defibrillator pads haven't expired. The rhythm of it is meditative, muscle memory from civilian work, though her real muscle memory comes from somewhere else, somewhere 18 years ago when the stakes were different and the rules were written in blood. She pushes that down like she pushes down everything else. The scrubs cover her forearms. Long sleeves even in summer. Norfolk's heat has never been an excuse. At 0300, the radio crackles. Police escort incoming, ETA for minutes. Seizing John Doe, no identification, found unresponsive in a parking garage on East Main Street. Elena moves to the receiving bay. The paramedics arrive before the police do, the ambulance backing in with its lights painting the concrete in strobing red. The sound of the hydraulic lift opening is sharp, mechanical, the stretcher emerging with a man mid-seizure, his body rigid and thrashing while one paramedic holds an airway mask and another calls out vitals. 28-year-old male, the paramedic shouts, generalized tonic-clonic, started about 40 minutes ago, no medical history available, no wallet, no identification found. The man's clothes are decent, khaki cargo pants, a worn denim jacket, but his body is lean in a way that suggests discipline, not deprivation. There's something in his bearing even unconscious that Elena recognizes the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in 2 decades. The recognition makes her breath catch. She helps transfer him to the trauma bed, hand steady on the rails, eyes on the monitors. Blood pressure 147/89. Heart rate 112. Oxygen saturation 94 on supplemental. The seizure activity is slowing, the medication the paramedics push now coursing through his system. Elena reaches for the trauma shears hanging from her neck, equipment so close to her skin that it's like a second heartbeat, and cuts away his shirt to expose his chest for the monitor pads. The denim jacket comes off in one motion. And then she sees it. The tattoo on his shoulder stops her hands. It's a 75th Regiment Ranger tab rendered in black ink, the specific design sharp and precise, not decorative like some civilian interpretation. She's seen this exact design once before in her life, in a field hospital in Ramadi 20 years ago, where she stood over a dying 8-year-old Iraqi boy while his mother screamed outside the perimeter and blood ran across the concrete floor. She stitched the boy's abdomen with combat medical training and hand steady from 4 prior surgeries that week. She gave him her own blood when his type wasn't available and whispered to him in fractured Arabic that his mother was waiting. He didn't make it past the infection that set in 48 hours later. She held his hand when he stopped breathing because that was her job, and because someone needed to. Elena's hands are shaking. She can feel the tremor in her fingers, the adrenaline spike that shouldn't be happening, that she thought she'd trained out of herself in the last 18 years of civilian life. She forces the shaking down into her chest where it crystallizes into a cold, sharp point. The monitor pads go on. She logs the admission time, 0307 hours, and her fingers move through the protocol like they always do. Blood cultures. Tox screen. Basic metabolic panel. The man's jacket lies on the chair beside the bed. She tries not to look at it. She fails. When she reaches for the jacket to bag it as patient belongings, her fingers find the lining. Sewn carefully into the interior jacket pocket, small stitches that speak of military precision, is a faded unit patch. The 75th Regiment insignia. Her breath stops. The room tilts slightly and then compensates. She has spent 18 years training her body not to react. The training holds, barely. She closes her fingers around the patch without removing it, keeping it hidden inside the jacket, and that's when Dr. Caldwell enters the trauma bay. His eyes move between Elena and the unconscious patient with the calculation of a man who has already decided he's watching something he'll want to remember. Elena's hands are at her sides. Her face is composed. Her voice, when she speaks, carries no tremor. 28-year-old male, seizing on arrival, vital stable post-medication, awaiting tox screen results. Admitted as John Doe pending identification. The words are professional and empty, and they taste like ash. Caldwell nods, makes a note, and leaves. But the weight of his observation remains like a hand on her spine. She finishes the intake. She cycles through her shift with the same invisible precision she's perfected over 6 years. She checks the patient's vitals every 30 minutes. She monitors the force sight. She notes the seizure medication levels. Around 0430, with the hospital in the deepest part of its night, she finds herself standing in the ICU doorway looking at the man in room 347. His face is younger than she expected. His hands are scarred from work. On his opposite shoulder, now visible in the fluorescent light, is what looks like a burn mark shaped like a handprint, the kind you get when you grab hot metal without thinking because thinking isn't an option anymore. She has promised herself she would never be this person again. She has promised the Pentagon, herself, and a boy who died 20 years ago that she would disappear completely into this life. She has kept that promise. She has moved through these corridors like a ghost, healing without letting it touch her, saving lives without remembering that she was ever the kind of woman who ran toward gunfire instead of away from it. But that was before the tattoo. That was before the faded patch sewn inside a jacket with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing when they hid it. That was before she understood that some debts don't get erased just because the government says they do, and some people carry your memory in their skin even when you thought you'd buried it so deep that not even God could find it. She reaches up and touches the trauma shears hanging from her neck, the metal cold under her fingertips, and understands with absolute clarity that her invisible life just ended. The overhead speaker crackled at 0600, and Dr. Caldwell's voice filled the 4th floor like diesel exhaust in a garage. Lena the bleeder to the supply room. Lena the bleeder. Your excessive gauze usage during the Morrison procedure requires immediate review. The page repeated twice. Elena stood at the medication cart pulling 0.5 milligrams lorazepam for room 412, her hand steady as surgical lasers, not pausing. Not flinching. Around her, 3 nurses' heads snapped up. The one nearest, younger, maybe 3 years in, blinked hard and looked away. Elena didn't look up from the drawer. She pulled the next medication. Then the next. The fluorescent lights hummed their white noise above her. Someone coughed. The call button for room 408 lit up red. She continued her work as if the entire 4th floor hadn't just heard her reduced to a nickname, as if Caldwell hadn't engineered that page to carry through every hallway, every patient room, every corner where staff congregated for morning huddles. That was stage 2 of a calculated sequence. Elena understood this now with the clarity that came from watching men use power as a weapon. Caldwell had studied her for 6 months, watched her challenge his new billing code protocol that prioritized insurance reimbursement over patient safety, witnessed her quiet refusal to discharge a 74-year-old with untreated sepsis because the criteria weren't met, seen how other nurses actually listened when she spoke instead of nodding toward whatever hierarchy existed on paper. Fear-based authority crumbles when someone doesn't fear losing their job. So he was building a paper trail. Documentation. Witnesses. Public humiliation to establish the narrative before he moved to the endgame. Elena had seen military commanders use identical tactics, create a record, establish superiority, isolate the target through peer pressure and shame. She finished pulling medications for her for assigned patients and moved toward the supply closet where extra for bags were stored. The Morrison procedure had used more gauze than protocol dictated, the patient had bled more than expected, and Elena had stopped the bleeding, and the patient had lived. Caldwell appeared as she was restocking the shelves, his body filling the doorway completely. The supply closet was narrow. 4 feet by 6. The overhead light flickered in a way that suggested the ballast was dying. "You think that little performance made you look competent?" His voice was low now, calibrated to be heard only inside this enclosed space. The door swung closed behind him. He didn't block it, he stood in the frame as if blocking came naturally, as if his presence alone was enough. "Every challenge you make to my protocols. Every question. Every eye roll in the staff meeting. I've documented everything. 37 separate incidents in 6 months. Insubordination. Failure to follow chain of command. Excessive resource usage." His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, cold and calculating. "You understand what happens next, Martinez? I make one phone call. Your licensing board gets a summary of your pattern. You'll spend 18 months fighting allegations. You'll be working at a veterinary clinic in Raleigh if you're lucky." Elena reached for another box of gauze on the shelf above her head. Her hands were steady. She could feel her heartbeat, controlled, measured, like a pilot executing a landing under instrument conditions. She didn't respond immediately. She pulled down the box, turned slightly to place it on the lower shelf, then looked at him. One measured breath. She let it escape slowly. A single tear escaped from her left eye, not from fear, from pressure, from the weight of 6 years of this suffocation in a civilian hospital that didn't know she'd once commanded a medical unit that saved lives under actual fire. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Without stepping back. Without yielding an inch. "You're making a mistake you don't have the clearance to understand." Caldwell laughed. A sharp, dismissive bark that bounced off the metal shelving. "Clearance? You're a night shift nurse in Norfolk. You stock gauze and empty bedpans." He stepped back from the doorway, and his confidence was absolute. He was certain he'd broken her. He walked away believing he'd established dominance, leaving her alone in the supply closet with the flickering light and the smell of antiseptic so strong it coated the back of her throat. Elena stood there for exactly 13 seconds. Then she resumed her work, restocking supplies with the precision of someone completing a mission. But the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the carefully controlled fury of a woman who'd spent 20 years learning that patience is a weapon that never misfires. The parking lot confrontation came 6 hours later as the evening shift prepared to leave and the night shift arrived, the two crews moving like parallel currents through the hospital entrance. Rain had started falling at 14:30, light at first, then heavier. The asphalt was dark and slick. Elena carried her coffee in a paper cup, Sacred Heart's bitter blend that tasted like it had been brewed at 0400, and her keys were already in her pocket. Caldwell stood near the entrance where the light from the ER doors spilled across the pavement. He waited until Elena was close enough that the incoming night shift staff could hear. Until 20 people minimum were within range. His voice carried across the parking lot like a public address system. Martinez. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to float pool rotation. Your pattern of insubordination and protocol violations has rendered you unfit for permanent unit assignment. You'll receive your new schedule by email. He turned and walked back inside without waiting for acknowledgement. Just stated it as fact. Established it as truth in front of witnesses. Elena stood holding her coffee, rain starting to darken her scrubs, darkening her hair. The water ran cold down the back of her neck. 3 of the incoming night shift nurses were staring. One was already pulling out her phone. Sacred Heart's grapevine moved faster than the pneumatic tube system in the walls. Float pool meant no continuity of care, no assigned patients, no routine. It meant being rotated through different floors daily based on staffing needs. It meant Caldwell could claim she was too unstable for commitment, too problematic for trust. It was a cage constructed carefully enough that no one could see the bars. Elena didn't speak. She took a sip of her coffee. The cup was warm against her palms. She looked up at the rain falling through the sodium vapor lights, each drop catching amber illumination as it fell. And then she heard it, a code called overhead for room 347. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. All available staff respond. But that wasn't what made her move. She'd already taken 3 steps back toward the entrance when the detail registered. Room 347 was not in Trauma Bay 4. The overhead operator had misidentified the location. The John Doe in room 347 was on the 4th floor, not the 1st. The day shift nurse assigned to his care was a recent graduate named Patricia who had excellent clinical instincts but made errors under pressure, and Patricia was not going to recognize what Elena recognized immediately from the monitor display she'd glimpsed earlier during her float pool assignment on that floor. The patient's oxygen saturation had been 89% at 1,100 hours. It would be worse now. Much worse. She was already moving toward the ER entrance when security stopped her. A new face she didn't recognize, badge number 4758, her own identification number, she realized. They were flagging her by her number now. Ms. Martinez, you're not assigned to this code. The guard was professional, neutral, not apologetic. He was following orders. Dr. Caldwell's directive. Float pool staff stand clear of active emergencies unless specifically requested. Elena stopped. She could see through the glass doors into the ER where organized chaos was unfolding, lights brightening as the team assembled, the crash cart being wheeled, someone already pulling the defibrillation pads. She watched for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned and walked back to the parking lot. The rain was harder now, falling like applause. She got into her car and sat in the parking lot of Sacred Heart Hospital with the engine running and the windshield wipers on intermittent, watching the glass doors, counting her breathing. Tactical breathing. For count in, hold for 4, for count out. The rhythm she'd learned in the field when she had to stay calm while holding a kid's intestines in place and hoping the blood bank could match type O negative in time. At 1847, her work phone buzzed. A message from security. She opened it and read, Employee Badge 4758 Access Levels Modified. ICU Access Revoked. Surgical Supply Access Revoked. Pharmacy Access Revoked. Effective immediately. HR will contact within 24 hours. Elena set the phone on her passenger seat and watched the ER entrance from the parking lot. She didn't leave. Not yet. Because some debts are written in blood, and some people carry your memory in their cells even when you thought you'd buried it so deep that the government's classified stamps couldn't touch it. And a woman who'd held a dying child in Ramadi 20 years ago doesn't forget the shape of that responsibility when it walks into her hospital wearing a 75th Regiment tattoo and someone else's ignorance. The rain kept falling. The float pool assignment came through at 6:13 a.m., printed on a sheet of paper taped to the break room bulletin board next to a flyer for the hospital blood drive. Elena read it twice to make sure she hadn't misunderstood the syntax. Pediatrics. Wing C, 3rd floor. Day shift starting immediately. Not ICU. Not the adult ward where the John Doe in room 347 had been sleeping under sedation for 72 hours with a 75th Regiment tattoo visible on his shoulder whenever the nurses adjusted his hospital gown. Dr. Caldwell had signed the reassignment himself. His signature was all sharp angles and aggressive pressure, the kind of handwriting that looked like it was stabbing the paper. Elena traced the letters with her thumb, understanding the message without needing him to spell it out. This wasn't a scheduling adjustment. This was a cage. And he'd made it subtle enough that no HR violation would stick, because technically she was a float pool nurse, technically she was assigned where she was needed, technically there was nothing wrong with sending her to the opposite wing of the hospital where pediatric patients needed routine care, and she would be exactly 427 steps away from the ICU. She knew it was 427 steps because she'd walked them once, counting, after her second night shift 6 months ago when she'd realized the architecture of Sacred Heart was designed like a maze specifically to separate different care levels. Pediatrics to ICU. The longest possible distance. Elena changed into fresh scrubs and clipped her badge to the neckline without meeting anyone's eyes in the locker room. 3 other nurses were changing shifts, talking about a staffing shortage on surgical, someone's kid being sick, the usual geography of hospital gossip. Nobody mentioned the John Doe. Nobody mentioned Caldwell's parking lot humiliation from the afternoon before. Norfolk's medical community was small enough that people talked, but not small enough that anyone did anything about what they heard. The pediatrics wing smelled different. Brighter somehow, though smell didn't have brightness, that was synesthesia, that was her brain misfiring from sleep deprivation and stress. But there was definitely a sweetness underneath the antiseptic, from the fruit-scented hand sanitizers they kept in every room, from the cartoon characters painted on the walls. The pediatrics wing was designed to be friendly. The nurses wore brightly colored scrubs. The wall clock was shaped like a monkey with moving hands for arms. It was supposed to comfort children who were scared. Elena found her assignment sheet at the nurse's station. For patients, all stable. A 7-year-old with a broken arm. A 6-year-old recovering from an appendectomy. A 10-year-old with asthma being monitored for discharge. An 8-year-old post-surgical for something her chart didn't specify because she didn't need to know, it wasn't her pass to excavate. Her job was vitals, charting, making sure the 4 lines stayed patent. Basic nursing. Mindless nursing. The kind of work that would keep her hands busy and her brain separated from the ICU where the patient with the Ranger tattoo lay somewhere behind 427 steps and whatever security clearance Caldwell had managed to invoke. She made it through the morning like a woman moving underwater. Vitals at 8:15 a.m. Medication administration at 9:16 a.m. Wound checks at 10 a.m. The work was easy enough that her hands could do it while the rest of her attention was somewhere else, which was dangerous, which was why she forced herself to focus on each task with military precision. 1 patient. 1 vital sign. 1 foot check. Don't skip steps. Don't miss details. Don't let the mind wander to room 347. At 10:24 a.m. she tried to log into the nursing station computer to pull up the remote monitor feed from the adult ward. The hospital system allowed float pool nurses to keep track of their home unit even when assigned elsewhere, basic situational awareness, standard protocol. Her login failed. Access denied. She tried again with the same result. The 3rd time the system locked her out completely, and an automated message appeared, "Your credentials have been restricted by Administrator Dr. Marcus Caldwell, 10:46 a.m. Contact hospital IT for questions. Elena stood very still in front of the monitor. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. There was no tremor in her jaw, no heat climbing up her neck. But something in her chest had shifted, like tectonic plates grinding against each other. Caldwell had used administrator privileges to lock her out of access to her own patient ward. Not just reassigned her. Not just separated her physically. Actively prevented her from monitoring the patient she'd been tracking since 3 a.m. on day 1. The message was clear. Whatever happens in room 347 while you're trapped on the wrong side of this hospital, you won't see it coming. You won't know about it until it's over. You'll be helpless. She closed the browser window and went to check on the 8-year-old surgical site. The incision was healing cleanly, no signs of infection, vitals stable. The child was reading a picture book and didn't look up when Elena came in. Elena performed her check with the same mechanical precision she'd brought to everything else: temperature, respiration, oxygen saturation, heart rate. She wrote the numbers in the chart. She left the room. The ticking clock was now invisible, but it was running. The John Doe had been there 72 hours. Caldwell had shown no interest in the patient until Elena had proven she could stay calm under humiliation, until she'd demonstrated that standard protocol wasn't enough to break her, until he'd realized that she represented a type of resistance he couldn't simply override with administrative authority. Now he was trying a different approach. Isolation. Separation. The removal of her ability to influence outcomes. Elena understood the strategy because she'd used similar tactics in Ramadi. Divide the target from their support structure. Restrict their access to intelligence. Force them to react emotionally because they're operating in darkness. The only difference was that Caldwell thought she was a nurse, not a major who'd spent 2 years learning how to maintain operational effectiveness under psychological pressure. At 1:27 p.m. the code blue alarm screamed through the hospital intercom like something alive and wounded. Code blue, ICU, room 347. Not a calm voice. A voice that had already escalated twice through the hospital's emergency protocol without resolving whatever crisis had triggered it. Elena moved before conscious thought could catch up to her muscles. She was moving. The pediatric station was behind her. Wing C was behind her. She was in the stairwell moving down because elevators would take 30 seconds longer and she was counting seconds now. Down for flights. Her legs remembered the stride pattern from 100 training runs in Iraq heat. The stairwell door on the first floor. The hallway. Left turn. Right turn. The ICU entrance. The crash cart was parked outside room 347 with 2 nurses wheeling it inside. The attending physician was running. She could hear him barking orders, could hear the defibrillator pads being placed, could hear the desperate efficiency of a code that was already deteriorating into panic. The heart monitor wasn't responding to the first shock. Asystole. Flat line. The patient had been down for 90 seconds minimum. Dr. Caldwell was standing in the doorway like he'd been waiting for her. "You're not assigned to this floor, Martinez. Leave or I'm calling security." Elena didn't stop moving. She pushed past him and into the room. The space smelled like blood and fear and the sharp ozone burn that followed a defibrillator discharge. The ranger was on the bed, his chest already exposed, the attending physician working with the confidence of someone trained but not skilled at this specific crisis. Compressions. 60 compressions per minute. Inadequate. The monitor showed nothing but a flat line. 105 seconds. Elena scanned the crash cart. Intubation kit. Epinephrine. Defibrillator pads already placed. And a scalpel, still in its sterile package, untouched. She grabbed it. "What are you doing?" Caldwell's voice rose behind her, but she was already moving toward the patient, already positioning herself, already seeing the landmarks on his chest the way she'd seen them before on bodies in field conditions where standard protocol was a luxury nobody could afford. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. That's where you go in. That's the approach for a thoracotomy when everything else has failed and the patient is actively dead and you have nothing to lose because there is no protocol left to violate. Her hands moved with muscle memory that belonged to a major who trained at Fort Sam Houston and spent 3 combat rotations learning anatomy on cadavers and living patients and the spaces between survival and catastrophe. No tremor. No hesitation. The scalpel cut through the skin between his ribs with the precision of a surgeon who'd done this before, who'd done this when she was covered in Ramadi dust and a child was bleeding out and there was nobody else to do it. The blade went deeper. Between the ribs. Through the intercostal muscles. Through the parietal pleura with a soft hiss of air escaping as pressure equalized. 1 incision becoming 2. The space opening. Blood sprayed across her scrubs. Across her hands. The attending physician had stepped back, frozen in the moment where he understood that something outside his training was happening and he didn't have the authority or the knowledge to stop it. The monitors were still flat-lined. 130 seconds. Elena reached into the chest cavity and found the heart. Massive, still, unresponsive. Her palm pressed against the anterior wall. She began to massage. Her hands moving in rhythmic compression, the cardiac tissue responding to direct stimulation the way it wouldn't respond to external compressions through the ribs and breastbone. 30 compressions. 40. 60. The room had gone dead silent except for the wheeze of the ventilator and the sound of her own breathing. Everyone else had stopped moving. Caldwell was in the doorway, his face showing cold calculation, not relief, already processing consequences, already counting costs. 90 compressions. 100. The heart muscle twitching against her palm, responding to the electrical activity still firing through the tissue, responding to the direct intervention that standard protocol would never have authorized. 120 compressions. The monitor beeped. Once. Just a single beep. Elena continued the compression rhythm, her palm working against the living tissue, the ventilator pushing oxygen into the lungs, the medications in his bloodstream finally meeting the electrical impulse they needed to propagate. The monitor beeped again. Sinus rhythm. Slow. Irregular. But sinus. Viable. The patient was alive. Elena stepped back. Her hands were covered in blood. Her scrubs were covered in blood. The room was the color of trauma and successful desperation, and the ranger on the bed was breathing with the help of the ventilator and the force of her will and the decision she'd made to break protocol rather than let hierarchy kill him. She met Caldwell's eyes across the silent room. His expression hadn't changed. Relief was impossible. He was already thinking about phone calls. About documentation. About how to turn this into liability instead of heroism. The attending physician found his voice first. Someone get a trauma surgeon. Get him prepped for emergency thoracic repair. And someone call cardiothoracic. Elena turned back to the ranger one more time. The tattoo on his exposed shoulder was clear in the harsh fluorescent light. 75th Regiment. The specific design. The one from Ramadi. The one she'd memorized 20 years ago when she was holding a dying child and promising herself she'd never see that symbol on a body that didn't survive. This one had survived. Because she'd made sure. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Caldwell was still standing in the doorway, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the patient. He wasn't thinking about whether she'd just saved a life that would have been lost under standard protocol. He was thinking about how to burn her for it. The scalpel came off the crash cart before Caldwell finished his thought. Elena didn't wait. Didn't ask. Didn't breathe. Her hands moved like they'd been waiting 6 years for permission they'd never actually need. The blade was sterile. The angle was precise. Every movement muscle memory that no civilian nurse should possess, that no amount of suppression could bury deep enough when a heartbeat flatlined 3 feet away. She cut between his ribs. 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line. The textbook coordinates of a woman who'd learned anatomy not from books but from combat. Blood spilled across her gloved fingers, dark and urgent, and she didn't flinch. Couldn't flinch. Major Martinez didn't have the luxury of flinching. The chest cracked open under her palms and she was there, hands inside a cavity only trained military medics knew how to navigate, massaging the heart with a kind of pressure that came from holding 17 American lives together in a field hospital while mortars landed outside the perimeter. His heart stuttered. Once. Twice. The rhythm came back like a light switching on in a dark room. Sinus rhythm. Blood pressure climbing. O2 sat rising, 62, 71, 84, climbing still. The monitor sang its mechanical song and Elena stepped back, her scrub top painted crimson, her hand steady as surgical steel. The patient's eyes fluttered open. He was alive because a nurse had just violated every protocol Caldwell had written, had just proven that sometimes the law of the hospital meant less than the law of survival. Caldwell stood in the doorway watching. Not with wonder. Not with gratitude. With calculation. His eyes moved across the scene like he was cataloguing evidence instead of witnessing a resurrection. He didn't see a life saved. He saw opportunity. He saw insubordination. He saw the exact leverage he needed to dismantle her completely. She'd given him the weapon. She'd used it in front of witnesses. The scrub room sink ran hot. Elena washed blood from her hands and forearms, the water turning pink then clear then pink again. Steam rose off her wrists. She didn't hear the phone calls at first, just the white noise of hospital machinery, the distant beep of monitors, the hiss of the ventilator in the ICU bay. But Caldwell's voice carried through the thin walls with the clarity of a man who wanted to be heard, who wanted her to understand the weight of what came next. First call. His tone was clipped, official, the voice of a physician reporting to administrators. HR, this is Dr. Caldwell, Chief of Medicine. I'm reporting an unauthorized surgical procedure performed by nursing staff, immediate termination recommended, liability exposure is catastrophic. A pause. His voice dropped lower, more conversational. Yes. Elena Martinez. Employee 4758. No, she's not a physician assistant. She's a registered nurse who performed an open thoracic procedure without authorization or proper training. I need this documented before the patient's family inquires about the procedure. The second call came before Elena finished drying her hands. Friendlier tone now, the voice of two men who understood each other, who spoke the same language of power and protection. Richard, it's Caldwell. About that board meeting next month, I need you to understand we have a dangerous liability walking our corridors. Someone who thinks combat medic training from wherever she claims gives her the authority to ignore established protocols. A laugh. Low and calculated. No, not a doctor. That's the point. An RN with delusions of competence and a reckless disregard for the chain of command. She endangered the patient and violated a dozen regulations. I'm documenting everything. You should know this before the board votes on my proposals. The conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes. The third call was to security. No friendliness now. Pure command. This is Dr. Caldwell. I need immediate restrictions placed on employee Elena Martinez, badge 4758. Revoke all system access and computer privileges effective immediately. When she attempts to access patient records or enter restricted areas, she's to be escorted from the building. I'm classifying this as a security concern. The call ended. The message was clear. She was being erased from the hospital she'd served for 6 years before the sun came up. Elena returned to the ICU at 0700 the next morning. She didn't need to check on the ranger. She needed to see him alive. Needed confirmation that the thoracotomy had held, that his lungs had expanded properly, that the cardiac massage had bought him enough time for the hospital's trauma surgeons to stabilize him in ways she couldn't. She approached the ICU doors with her badge ready, muscle memory from 1,000 night shifts pulling her toward the entrance. The badge reader flashed red. Access denied. The magnetic lock didn't click open. Elena stood there for 3 seconds, processing. The charge nurse inside the glass partition saw her, made eye contact, then looked away fast enough to hurt. That was worse than any lock. She tried the adjacent door. Red. 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 3 doors. 3 denials. The system wasn't malfunctioning. The system was working exactly as Caldwell had designed it. By noon, HR called. The director's office was on the 3rd floor, decorated with the kind of corporate neutrality that made bad news feel bureaucratic instead of personal. Elena sat across from a woman named Patricia who couldn't quite meet her eyes and a manila folder that looked thicker than Elena's entire personnel file should have been. Your pattern of violations has become untenable, Patricia read, not her own words, Caldwell's words, rehearsed and documented. The folder opened. Missed medication time stamped on dates Elena had been on break. Charting errors on patients she'd never treated. Written warnings she'd never received. Handwriting that almost matched hers on incident reports that had never happened. 6 weeks of meticulous fabrication, each document a piece of the cage he'd been building since the day she'd questioned his protocols. These are procedural concerns, Patricia continued, combined with the unauthorized surgical procedure from yesterday. The hospital has a responsibility to maintain standards. We're going to have to ask for your resignation. Elena didn't argue. Didn't dispute the documents. Didn't do anything except sign the termination papers in the exact space where Patricia's pen pointed. One measured breath. No tears. No trembling. Just a nod and a question that came out in a voice so quiet Patricia almost missed it. The patient? The one eye? Stable, Patricia said, grateful to provide something truthful. He's improving faster than expected. But hospital policy dictates. I understand. Elena stood. The chair made no sound as she pushed it back, which meant she'd done it carefully, which meant some part of her was still playing the role of an ordinary nurse, still following the rules even as those rules were erasing her. The locker was in the basement, in the break room where night shift nurses kept their personal items in a long row of metal doors. Elena opened hers with muscle memory. Inside was 6 years of a life someone else was living. She found the cardboard box under the counter, someone's abandoned Amazon delivery, destined for recycling, and began filling it. The cracked world's okayest nurse mug that had made her smile on her worst nights. The dying succulent she'd been keeping alive on the shelf since a patient gave it to her 3 years ago. And the photograph. The one she kept hidden beneath her street clothes, wrapped in a hospital washcloth so nobody could see it by accident. The photograph was 20 years old. Faded. The colors had shifted toward yellow and sepia. But the face was unmistakable. A woman in combat fatigues holding an 8-year-old Iraqi boy on a stretcher, blood visible on both of them, the field hospital behind them rendered in soft focus from the camera angle. The woman had a call sign written on her armor in faded marker, Sandstorm. Elena held the photograph for exactly 10 seconds. Then it went into the box. She taped the box closed with hospital tape, picked it up, and walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital at 14:33 on a day in late September when the weather had turned toward rain. The bus stop was across the street. She sat on the bench while water soaked through the cardboard, watching the hospital entrance where 3 doctors walked in and one orderly wheeled a stretcher out. Routine. The machine kept running. Dr. Caldwell was probably in his office right now, making another call, ensuring her erasure was complete, already forgetting the woman whose hands had saved a life 12 hours earlier. The rain fell harder. The cardboard began to disintegrate. And Elena Martinez, who had once been Major Martinez, who had once commanded a field hospital under fire, who had held 17 American soldiers alive long enough to helicopter them to safety, waited for the number 7 bus and tried not to think about what came next. But something was coming. Something larger than Caldwell, larger than Sacred Heart, larger than 6 years of hiding behind scrubs and a name that wasn't really hers. The sound would arrive first, rotor wash that rattled windows and tore up landscaping. Then boots. Then voices asking for someone the hospital record said didn't exist. And that's when the real reckoning would begin. That's when everyone would learn exactly who they'd been standing next to, teaching how to follow rules she'd learned to break to keep people alive. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody had paid to see. Elena stood at the bus stop with a cardboard box balanced against her hip, the kind of box used to carry a life's worth of hospital memories in 5 minutes. Inside, a cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a dying succulent she'd kept on her locker shelf for 3 years, its leaves browning at the edges like old paper, and a photograph in a frame that cost $7 at the hospital gift shop. The photo showed a field hospital in Ramadi, 2004. 19 faces in desert camouflage, all of them looking at the camera with the particular exhaustion that comes from keeping people alive with equipment held together by prayer and duct tape. Elena stood third from the left, her hair cut short, her eyes the color of flint. She was smiling. You had to look close to see it, but it was there, the smile of someone who'd discovered that she was capable of anything, even when that anything meant holding an 8-year-old boy's abdomen together while his blood soaked through her gloves and morphine ran out at hour for of an 18-hour shift. She didn't look at that photograph anymore. Not since she'd arrived at Sacred Heart 6 years ago and buried Major Elena Martinez so deep that even she sometimes forgot the woman in the photo had ever existed. The rain soaked through the box. She could feel it softening the cardboard, could feel the frame inside starting to warp. She didn't move. The bus was 11 minutes late. In her other life, she would have calculated the probability of whether her hands would shake by the time it arrived. Now she just stood in the rain and let it fall. What she didn't know was that someone had recognized her. Not from the photograph. Not from anything she'd done in the past 6 years of quiet nights and careful invisibility. He had recognized her from a tattoo, a piece of ink on his shoulder that matched the design she'd felt beneath her fingers in an ICU at 3 in the morning when she cut away a dying man's shirt. The design itself was simple, a tab with a Ranger scroll, numerals reading 75, a combat dagger, but its placement was specific. Only a handful of soldiers got that tattoo in that exact location at that exact time. The Pentagon knew who they were. And the Pentagon knew she'd saved one of them. The phone in her pocket hadn't buzzed in 3 days. She'd stopped checking it around hour 42 of her unemployment. There wasn't anyone left to call her. Caldwell had made sure of that, whispers to the nursing pool about her instability, her willingness to break protocol, a complete lack of respect for institutional hierarchy. The narrative was clean. He'd crafted it well. The rotor wash came without warning. One moment the parking lot was quiet except for rain and traffic noise from the distant interstate. The next moment the air pressure changed like the world had taken a breath inward. Elena's head came up. She knew that sound. UH-60M Blackhawks, twin rotor wash, military-spec transmission whining at 6,000 revolutions per minute. 2 of them, descending fast, no civilian marker patterns, moving with the precision of pilots trained at Fort Rucker who'd logged time in Kandahar and Fallujah. The hospital windows rattled. An elderly man waiting for the same bus turned to her with wild eyes. "Is that military?" Elena said. "Don't worry. They're not here for you." The Blackhawks didn't land at the helipad. They came down in the parking lot itself, tilting as they decelerated, throwing concrete dust and water droplets sideways. The rain didn't slow them. Military pilots landed in worse. The rotor wash pushed Elena's wet hair into her face. She didn't brush it away. The cardboard box grew heavier in her arms. Inside the hospital, the staff froze. That was what Elena later heard from 2 different nurses she ran into at the VA clinic, that every monitor seemed to stop beeping for a moment, that the fluorescent lights flickered as if the building itself was holding its breath. The doors burst open at 0602. For Rangers in dress uniform, Class A blues with dress jackets and polished brass, walked through Sacred Heart Medical Center's main corridor like they were moving through Kandahar, eyes scanning, shoulders level, their posture broadcasting authority in a frequency that had nothing to do with hospital hierarchy. Their berets bore the distinctive Ranger tab. The centermost soldier carried an official portfolio marked Department of Defense in gold letters. "We're looking for Major Elena Martinez," the lead ranger said to the charge nurse. His voice carried the particular clarity of someone accustomed to giving orders to people who understood that compliance wasn't a suggestion. "We have reason to believe she's on this floor. Call sign Sandstorm." The charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Sacred Heart for 18 years, went pale. That's not a name. She worked nights, the second ranger said. His eye swept across the unit. Combat medic training. Wouldn't advertise it. Someone who keeps her head down. The entire morning shift stood motionless. They knew Elena. They'd worked alongside her. They'd watched Caldwell destroy her. Not a single person spoke up. But the John Doe in room 347 heard the voices. He'd been sedated for 2 days, his body recovering from the seizure, from the resuscitation, from the miracle that had pulled him back from whatever edge he'd been standing on. The sedation was lightening. Consciousness came in waves. And somewhere in those waves, he heard those voices, heard the call sign, heard the name Sandstorm, and his eyes opened with a clarity that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. A nurse noticed. The monitors began tracking his wakefulness. His heart rate climbed from resting 70 to climbing 90, alert now, tracking something. They brought him a cup of water, and he drank it without asking questions, keeping his eyes on the door, waiting. And then she walked in. Elena had abandoned the cardboard box at the bus stop. It didn't matter anymore. She'd gotten a call from someone at Norfolk FBI field office, a woman named Agent Richardson with a voice that suggested she didn't waste words. "You're Major Elena Martinez, weren't you?" the agent had said. "Ramadi Field Hospital, 2004. We need you at Sacred Heart immediately. Don't ask questions. Your status is about to become public. We'd like to manage that." Elena had walked back into the hospital. It took 40 seconds. The doors were the same doors she'd pushed through 6 years ago as a civilian. The tile was the same. But something in the air had changed, the pressure, the tone, the way people's eyes tracked her movement. The patient in room 347 began to cry when he saw her. Not a sound at first. Just tears streaming down his face, his body shaking against the 4 lines, his hand reaching out toward her with the intensity of someone who hadn't cried in 20 years and had finally found a reason to break. "Major," he whispered. His voice cracked. "You gave me your own blood in Ramadi when I was 8 years old. You made me want to serve." He took a breath that sounded like it was tearing something inside him open. "I joined the Rangers because of you. Because you stayed. Because you didn't leave." Elena's hands went still. The soldier continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm Corporal Thomas Reeves. You don't remember, I was the boy from the rescue op, from the compound, the one who got hit during extraction. You stitched me for 8 hours. You kept talking to me. You said," his voice fractured. "You said we'd both see sunrise together." They had seen sunrise. Elena remembered now. She remembered a child with catastrophic abdominal trauma, remembered knowing he wouldn't survive on morphine and field dressing, remembered cutting open her own field medical pack and drawing blood from her own arm into a syringe because the blood bank had been destroyed 6 hours earlier. She'd transfused her own blood directly into his femoral line while counting breaths and praying to God in languages she didn't know. She'd promised him sunrise. And here he was. Alive. 20 years older. A ranger. Stitched back together by muscle and determination and the clarity that comes from knowing someone refused to let you die. The SEAL team commander arrived at 0847. He came with paperwork and authority and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been briefed in detail about a situation that had spiraled beyond containment. He walked into the hospital boardroom where Dr. Caldwell sat with 3 board members and a hospital lawyer, all of them frantically trying to understand why the military had just seized federal jurisdiction over a private hospital's employment matter. "Dr. Caldwell," the SEAL commander said. His name was Commander David Mercer. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, power at rest. "I'm here to inform this board that Major Elena Martinez holds a Silver Star." He opened the portfolio. Silence. She also holds 2 bronze stars. He placed the medals on the table, arranged in ascending order of precedence. And 2 purple hearts. The board members stared at the medals like they might detonate. These medals are for an operation classified at presidential level. Her records were sealed at DoD level for national security. She was ordered into civilian cover status indefinitely, effective immediately after an extraction operation went sideways in Ramadi in 2004. She was not permitted to disclose her military status, her service record, or her former rank under any circumstance, regardless of civilian pressure. This includes employment reviews, background checks, and hostile interrogation by civilian supervisors. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old concrete. You terminated an active duty officer under federal protective cover, Mercer continued. You attempted to damage her personnel record. You fabricated documentation that contradicts a classified operations timeline. This is a federal matter now. The FBI agents arrived at 1342, moving through Sacred Heart's main lobby with the casual authority of people who'd already reviewed security footage and knew exactly where they were going. They found Dr. Caldwell in his office, attempting to delete emails from his personal hard drive. The forensic specialists had recovered 47 messages already. 3 separate phone calls logged in hospital records, made immediately after Elena's emergency thoracotomy, connected him to the HR department, the board chairman, and a security firm that had restricted her access within 90 minutes. You tried to cover your termination of a federally protected witness, the lead agent said flatly. His name was Agent Morrison, and he had the particular expression of someone who'd prosecuted white-collar criminals for 17 years and had stopped being surprised by their stupidity. That's evidence tampering. The fabricated employment file is fraud. You altered her personnel records after the fact. That's conspiracy and obstruction. You're going to want a lawyer. By 6 o'clock that evening, news cameras were positioned in Sacred Heart's parking lot. Caldwell's perp walk happened at 1847, and every Norfolk station covered it. The man who'd built his career on institutional hierarchy and board connections, the chief of medicine who'd wielded power like a weapon, moved down the hospital steps in handcuffs with FBI agents flanking him on both sides. His lawyer made useless statements to the cameras. The story was already written: evidence tampering, fraud, conspiracy. The fabricated documentation was in every reporter's hands within an hour. The timeline showing his calls made before any investigation was complete made it impossible to construct a narrative that favored him. He'd outmaneuvered himself into a corner. Elena watched the footage later, in a quiet office at Walter Reed Medical Center, where she'd been transferred under emergency federal medical credentialing that restored her commission within 72 hours. Major Elena Martinez, MD, combat medicine specialist, authorized to practice independently within military medical facilities. The Pentagon released a statement acknowledging that her emergency medical intervention in civilian hospital setting had saved a classified military asset, that her qualifications exceeded current civilian standards, and that she was restored to active duty effective immediately. 6 months later, she stood in her office at Walter Reed, teaching a class of new combat medics. The office had windows that looked out on the parade ground. Her desk held a photograph in a frame, the Ramadi Field Hospital, 19 Faces, 2004. Corporal Reeves visited monthly, bringing other veterans who needed someone who understood what it felt like to exist between 2 worlds. Elena trained them in procedures that saved lives under conditions that would break most people. She spoke about triage and decision-making and the clarity that comes from accepting responsibility when the alternative is inaction. On her last visit to Norfolk, she'd gone back to Sacred Heart. Not to work. Just to visit former colleagues for coffee, to listen to their apologies, to forgive them with the same quiet dignity she'd shown while absorbing Caldwell's insults. They believed his narrative because it had been easier than defending someone they didn't really know. She passed through the employee entrance on her way out. The night security guard was checking IDs at the booth, the same booth she'd passed through countless times as just another nurse. The security guard looked up, and Elena saw recognition flicker across his face. His eyes dropped immediately. His hands trembled as he waved her through without asking for her badge. Dr. Caldwell, medical license revoked, career destroyed, checking IDs at the hospital he'd once run. Elena didn't speak to him. Didn't need to. She simply showed her visitor badge and kept walking, listening to the rain against the hospital windows, the sound carrying her back 20 years and forward 20 more simultaneously. Later that month, teaching another class of combat medics at Walter Reed, Elena finished the lecture with words they'd remember long after they left the room. True class is what you do when the lights go out. When no one's watching except the person who needs you. That's when you discover who you actually are. Not the titles you hold. Not the authority you think you have. Just the choices you make when it matters. The young medics didn't know she was talking about a rainy night at a bus stop when she could have stayed disappeared, or a moment in an ICU when she could have followed orders, or 20 years ago in Ramadi when she could have let a dying child go. They didn't know she was talking about Dr. Caldwell, who discovered exactly who he was when the pressure came down, and that person had deserved everything he got. If you've watched this far, you know there are people walking among us whose strength is measured not in titles but in choices. Subscribe so you don't miss the stories of those who've sacrificed everything. Like this video if you believe quiet strength deserves recognition. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value?